Where were you on March 9th, 2022, when President Biden signed the death warrant on American freedom? On that day, in a hush ceremony at the White House, without the approval of Congress, the states, or the American people, Biden signed into law Executive Order 14067. Buried in his order are a few paragraphs titled Section 4. The language in Section 4 makes Order 14067 the most treacherous act by a sitting president in the history of our republic, because Section 4 sets the stage for legal government surveillance of all U.S. citizens, total control over your bank accounts and purchases, and the ability to silence all dissenting voices for good. In this new war on freedom, the Dems aren't coming for your guns. No, they're thinking much bigger than that. They're coming for your money, and it's already started.
It can't get much worse than this.
Yeah, what's your take on President Biden?
He's a communist.
The latest focus regarding that has to do with President Biden's nominee to head the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, who has some views on cryptocurrencies. Our Jennifer Schomburger is covering that angle of things. And there was a hearing for this nominee yesterday.
Good Friday morning, Julie. That's right. President Biden's nominee for one of the top banking regulators in this country faced a mix of skepticism and agreement from U.S. senators on her views on digital assets during her confirmation hearing on Thursday. Sala Amarova, who's being vetted currently for the Comptroller of the Currency, which oversees the majority of the nation's banks, is concerned that large tech companies could control the payment infrastructure in the U.S. if private digital currencies are allowed to thrive, which could potentially displace the value of the U.S. dollar. While Democratic Senator Jack Reed agreed with her view on big tech, Republican Senator Cynthia Lummis said she's struggling with Amarova's views.
Chairman, I do want to note that not a single Republican on this committee has mentioned anything other than your position related to your nomination. I keep hearing my friends on the other side refer to personal attacks. One thing I can say and be very proud of on this committee from these Republicans, not a single person has talked about anything other than your stated positions as it relates to this nomination. So any suggestions otherwise is simply hogwash. I want to be fair, and I will be fair. I won't be hyperbolic, but I will be frank and honest. I cannot think of a nominee more poorly suited to be the Comptroller of the Currency based solely on your public positions, statements, and the weight of your writings than you are. Let me just quote you versus anybody else. On the Green New Deal champion, you proposed taking economic and climate policy making from Congress and creating an unaccountable bureaucracy called the National Investment Authority. In a roundtable this year, you pushed to make the NIA the dedicated institutional platform at the federal level for really being the kind of fighting muscle of the Green New Deal and fighting muscle of, all of these other movements that pursuing environmental justice, social, economic justice, equality, and so on. Your disdain for the financial services industry. In 2019, in a documentary titled, I'll be kind, Buttholes, A Theory, you said, the financial services industry, in my view, and I don't think I'm alone here, is the quintessential butthole industry. Killing American Energy and Jane Family Institute seminar in March of this year, you proposed bankrupting the coal and oil and gas industries, saying we want them to go bankrupt if we want to tackle the climate change. That's really hard to misunderstand. On nationalizing banking, last year, i.e. 2020, not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, just last year, paper you titled, The People's Ledger, How to Democratize Money and Finance the Economy. You proposed reforms to, and I quote, effectively end banking as we know it by nationalizing, the quote you had was effectively ending banking as we know it. How? By nationalizing retail banking. As it relates to the end of private banking, your words, no one else's. This year, not 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, this year, you said you proposed to imagine what it would be like if instead of just a public option for deposit banking, instead of just a public option for deposit banking, this would be actually the full transition. In other words, there would be no more private bank deposit accounts, and all of the deposit accounts would be held directly at the Fed. I want to say that one more time because this is what really, among all the other comments, it's quite disturbing. This is not a position that you took years ago. This is something that you spoke to this year. And I quote, imagine what it would be like if, instead of just a public option for deposit banking, this would be actually the full transition. In other words, there would be no more private bank deposit accounts, and all of the deposit accounts will be held directly at the Fed. I don't have any questions for you because there's nothing you can say today to undo what you've said for years, including this year. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senators.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
You used to be a member of a group called the Young Communist, didn't you?
Senator, are you referring to my membership in the Youth Communist Organization while I was growing up in the Soviet Union?
I don't know. I wanted to ask you that question.
Well, Senator,
There was a group called the Young Communists, and you were a member. Is that right?
I'm not exactly sure which group you're referring to.
Well, the formal name of it is the Leninist Communist Young Union of the Russian Federation, and it's also known as the Leninist Komsomol of the Russian Federation, and it's commonly referred to as the Young Communists. Were you a member?
Senator, I was born and grew up in the Soviet Union.
Yes, ma'am. But were you a member of that organization?
Everybody in that country was a member of the Komsomol, which was the Communist Youth Organization, because
So you were a member?
That was a part of normal progress in school.
Have you resigned
From the youth,
from the Young Communists?
you grow out of it with age, automatically.
Did you send them a letter though, resigning?
Senator, this was many, many years ago. As far as I remember how the Soviet Union worked, was at certain age, you automatically stop being a member of that
Could you look at your records and see if you can find a copy of your...
Senator Kennedy, I don't interrupt. I almost never interrupt these, but
Well, you always
Professor-
nearly me, Mr.
no,
President,
actually I don't.
and
Not
I
nearly
won't
as many
pursue-
times
I
as I'd
won't
like to.
pursue
No,
the line of questions.
she renounced her Soviet citizenship.
Well, I understand that, but you're not the witness. She is. Would you look at your records and see if you can find a letter of resignation for me?
Senator, as I explained, I was part of the Soviet population.
Yes, ma'am. I got that part. I just want to see if you look at your records and see if you find a letter of resignation. Let me tell you what, I've spent a lot of time on your record, and here's what I found. Look, this is America. You can believe what you want, but we can't just let anybody be controller of the currency. You wrote your thesis in college at Moscow State University on, the title was Karl Marx's Economic Analysis and the Theory of Revolution in the Capital. But you won't send Senator Toomey a copy. You studied at Moscow State University, scientific communism, which is the science regarding the working class struggle and the socialist agenda. In 2019, not 30 years ago, in a Canadian documentary, you called the financial services industry, quote, a quintessential asshole industry. You wrote a paper called Systemically Significant Prices, calling for the federal government to set wages, food, gas prices. In 2020, you wrote a paper called The People's Ledger, where you said we need to abolish bank accounts and make everybody set up an account at the Fed where the federal government will have access to your data. In 2020, you wrote another paper called The Climate Case for a National Investment Authority, where you said what we need to do, the oil and gas industry, is have the federal government bankrupt them so we can tackle climate change. In 2019, you joined a Facebook group, a Marxist Facebook group, to discuss socialist and anti-capitalist views. Now, that's what I see from your record. And you have the right to believe every one of these things. You do. This is America. But I don't mean any disrespect. I don't know whether to call you professor or comrade.
Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Omarova, in your article, which was published in a law review journal last month, was entitled The People's Ledger. That's the title. And you did advocate nationalizing the business of retail banking. In your words, and I quote, "This article outlines a series of structural reforms that would radically redefine the role of a central bank as the ultimate public platform for generating, modulating, and allocating financial resources in a democratic economy, the people's ledger," end quote. You also said this article accordingly advocates full migration of demand deposits onto the Fed's balance sheet. Now, this is meant to create a system. Oh, that's a quote, right? This article accordingly advocates full migration of demand deposits onto the Fed's balance sheet, end quote. According to your article, and I quote, "The proposed reform will effectively end banking." You put end banking in quotes, but this is all your quote. "The proposed reform will effectively end banking as we know it." Moreover, you've advocated that they lose all their deposits. And then you acknowledge that that means they wouldn't have the resources to lend money. And so you've constructed this whole mechanism whereby they could go to the Fed and get funding to make the loans, provided that they made loans in a fashion that the Fed approved of. I mean, that's the short version. Let me go on to another quote. Because this is right from that very same article published last month. You said, and I quote, "In principle, Fed accounts can be made available as an alternative to bank deposit accounts upon a person's request. As explained below, however, the more effective option would be to transition all deposits to the Fed." That sounds pretty straightforward. When you use words like advocate, and you talk about the proposal, and you talk about a preferred option, it sounds like that's what you were for. Are you no longer for those things? But this is what you recommended, and it doesn't seem to be a coincidence that every one of these thought experiments or academic ideas, every one of them, involved dramatic expansion in the power and control of the central government to allocate resources to control banking, and a corresponding diminution in the freedom of individual Americans and institutions. That's the common theme that comes up again and again and again. You use words like advocate, your preference. I mean, to suggest now that, well, maybe you're not really for these things, it's just hard. It's hard to believe this. We'll have more time in the second round, but I want to underscore the powers of the Comptroller of the currency are enormous. Powers to decide who gets to open a bank account, who doesn't, what kind of loans can and can't be offered. The opportunity to exercise a radical ideology through the powers of the Comptroller of the currency are chilling. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Reid.